5, 4.
Hello, I'm Denise Cochran, Director of Great Neck Library, and I'd like to welcome you to tonight's event, which is a collaboration between Great Neck Library and SHAI. We are honored to be having this event during National Library Week. Our library is a big part of our community. It's the center of the community, where all are welcome. But the library is not just about books. It's about keeping our histories, keeping our legacies. It's a place where we have books that contain our dreams and pathways to our future. It's important to our community. It's important to each of us. For tonight's event, I would like to thank the Great Neck Library Board of Trustees, Mimi Hu, President of the Great Neck Library Board of Trustees, and SHAI for supporting this event. I would also like to thank Adam Hines and Mike Meehan for logistical and technical support for the event. Now please allow me to introduce our moderator, the immediate past president of SHAI, Rebecca Sassouni.
Thank you, Denise, and thank you to the Great Neck Library. It's really a pleasure for SHAI to continue to collaborate with other institutions such as the library and as well schools, houses of worship, and the parks and any other community institutions that are interested in the plurality and the community that is Great Neck. SHAI is a not-for-profit organization that for 30 years has met the acculturative needs of the Persian Jewish community after the revolution in Iran, and including by providing scholarships to young students, setting out, including having events for singles, for families, and for senior citizens with the town of North Hempstead Senior Social Center. SHAI is proud to coordinate tonight's event because of the subject matter, and that is the life and the history of Habib Elghanayan, as illustrated and articulated beautifully in a very compelling book written by our author, Shahrzad Elghanayan. Shahrzad is the granddaughter of Habib Elghanayan and wrote from that perspective, but also she is an award-winning American journalist who works at NBC News as a senior photo editor. Previously, she worked at Bloomberg News and at the Associated Press, where she was a supervisor on the National Photo Desk. Before her journalism career, Shahrzad assisted with research at a human rights organization called Freedom House. Her op-eds based on the research for Titan of Tehran have appeared in the New York Times and the Washington Post, the LA Times, and CNN. Shahrzad was born in Tehran and raised in Manhattan. She graduated from Lycée Français and has a BA in political science from Columbia University. She lives in New York with her husband, Douglas Rao, a longtime journalist himself. Her book, Titan of Tehran, was 10 years in the making and has received consistently positive press, and it was on Vanity Fair's February list of 9 books we couldn't put down this month. Before I turn to Shahrzad, I would just like to say a few words by way of introduction of the book. I read the book as a person who was raised in the United States, never been to Iran, but has spent much of my adult life trying to reconcile what my parents taught me about our family's history and with my life here in the United States. I always dreamed that I would get to visit Iran, and I hope to still. When I learned of Shahrzad's book, and I borrowed it from the library, actually, I couldn't put it down. I shared it with my husband, with my in-laws, with my parents, with my children, and extended family. Everyone had what to say about this book, mainly because it's so resonant with all of our lives. Moreover, it resonates with the life of any immigrant group, I would say, which is the story of America and of Great Neck. And in particular, the story of Habib Elghanayan, a man who was your grandfather, resonates with people who never met him. So as a 9-year-old in the United States, when the revolution occurred, I didn't know about Iran, and I certainly didn't know about your family. But I will tell you that in the years since, the popular imagination about what happened when your grandfather was executed has taken on the stature and the importance of nothing less than, say, the assassination of JFK. Anyone I've spoken to who was alive at the time and knew about what was happening in Iran understood that when Habib Elghanayan was executed, that was a game changer, and it was historic, and they all remember where they were when they heard the news. And the fact that you took the time to research and spend 10 years writing this book is a credit not only to your grandfather, but also to the importance of that history to thousands and thousands of other people, like my family. And I want to thank you for accepting our invitation to join us tonight to discuss this important work. And I want to thank you in advance for trusting us with your story, since I understand from you, Shahrzad, that this is your first time doing a live interview on this subject. So thank you very much for being with us, Shahrzad.
Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you so much for having me. And thank you to the library and SHAI for hosting and sponsoring this event. It really means a lot to me.
And it means a lot to us as well.
Thank you.
Tell us a little bit, please, about yourself and why you felt it was important to write this book.
So, growing up, I knew that a great injustice had been inflicted on my family and on my grandfather. And I knew that my father had heard about his father's execution on the radio. We were in the United States when this happened, and so it meant that there were no goodbyes. And it meant that my grandfather was, by himself when this was happening. So it's something that stayed with me, and it's an image that I carried with me, throughout my life, of my grandfather standing blindfolded and facing a firing squad. And so, this big injustice is something that led me to do everything that I've done in my professional life, working in a human rights organization, as you mentioned, and for several news organizations. I always had this sense growing up that news is important and it affects somebody's life. And that it's important for the news to be recorded and, for posterity. And so I decided to write this. I always wanted to put the story down on paper. And I remember that in November of 2010, so now 12 years ago, 11 years ago, my grandfather's name was mentioned in a New York Times front page story, as it had been mentioned during when he was executed. And reading that story really made me realize that this was the time to write the book now.
What was the story about in the New York Times in 2010?
So the story was about a computer virus that sabotaged some of Iran's nuclear capability. And researchers who were trying to figure out who was behind this computer virus found a code in the virus, and the code was 1979-0509. And they, in deciphering it, they speculated, and we'll never know, that it was a reference to the date of my grandfather's execution. And so seeing that in a front page story showed me what a long shadow he still cast 30 years after his execution, which was also on the front page of the New York Times, the Washington Post, and other publications.
What are your recollections of your grandfather personally?
So I was 5 years old when we moved to America, and I don't have like very many recollections. And with time, they're all fading. But I remember having lunch at his house in Shamron. I remember he loved swimming, so there was a big pool in the back of the house that was fed by the waters of the Elborz Mountains. So I have those kinds of recollections. I also remember, personal remembrances, like my, knowing that he had sent my father to America when he was 9 to boarding school. So I knew those things about him, but I wasn't as close to him as, say, on my mother's side of the family. And I think it was very helpful in writing the book because I could, be an objective journalist, but also, do my job in collecting the information and presenting it as a whole.
Do you remember how old you were when you started to understand your grandfather's stature, both in the world of business and in philanthropy?
It was gradual. I knew that this terrible thing had happened to him, and I remember that when I was in middle school, my dad showed me this notebook. It was an amazing notebook. It was blue, and you opened it, and it had like dozens of newspaper clippings. And these newspaper clippings were all from when he was executed to a little bit after. So it was the news of his execution and the reaction to his execution. So I knew that his story was big enough to be front page news. And so I knew that this had happened, and I knew that it was also big enough for the U.S. Congress to pass a resolution to condemn it. So that I felt was very important, and that news that also meant that Khomeini was so upset that the Congress had done this, that he said that it was interference in Iran's internal affairs, and he decided he used that as an excuse to break his relations with Iran, which was a huge deal. And he didn't accept the next U.S. ambassador to come to Iran. So I knew that was a big deal. And then later there were I found out about, I knew that he had factories and that he was a big businessman, but I had two chapters in 2 books that really laid it all out. And, they were in various, in 2 books. So one was in the History of Contemporary Jews by Homer Sachar's great organization, and also by there was and that one was written by Ariel Levin, who was a diplomat in Iran at the time, who knew my grandfather and had written this nice chapter about his life and what had happened. And the second one was in a book by historian Abbas Milani, who has a great book. It's 2 tomes, and it's called The Men and Women Who Made Modern Iran. It's called Eminent Persians. And so my grandfather has a chapter in there that's about the economy and industrialists. So having those 2 chapters lay it out, and reading in a book made me realize, that he was somebody who was very important in Iran.
He brought plastic, and he brought various industrial equipment to a country that never had those before. The first high-rise buildings,
That's right.
Things that just hadn't been before and might not have been but for his life, and yet your grandfather. And so it sounds like you had a gradual realization of what he meant to people outside of your family. Tell us a little bit about how you went about conducting the research for this book. You did say that you're a journalist, and for those of us who've actually read the book, I can say that this is a meticulously documented, footnoted, with annotations book, as well as written with the humane perspective of someone who cares about the subject. Tell us how you reconciled those. How did you do your research and then add the humane piece?
Okay, so the research was, the best part of this process for me, because I got to interview over 30 people who were his family, relatives, friends, business partners, and also experts who could, describe the area where he grew up, for example. I could rely on books, other history books, so that it could be layered. It was important for me to have him, be at the center, but to give you an idea of Iranian Jewish history, and then layer it with the history of Iran at the time and what was happening outside. Then Iran's relationship with Israel and how that evolved. So it was great to have all those layers, and I tried not to put too much of myself in it. I tried to insert myself when I felt like it was important, or that the reader might want to know a little bit more about the person who's writing it.
You didn't really insert yourself at all, to my recollection, except at the end, but you did, of course, give context to his life as a family man, as a husband, as a parent, as a sibling. So how did you integrate those pieces of his life with what you've just said, the historical and geopolitical parts that you just referenced?
So one of the main questions I was trying to answer in the book was, why he stayed. So I had to get into, to get into understanding a little bit about what drove his decisions, and so I built the book out so that so that by the time you got to the end, you really knew who this man was. What his relationships were to people, to his country, to his children, to his wife. And that's what helps you to understand the ultimate decision that he made.
To stay.
To stay.
One of the things I was very surprised about when I read your book is that Ayatollah Khomeini had publicly denounced your grandfather back in the 1960s. This, to me, was made it less binary. It wasn't just the 1979 revolution. It seemed like there were long historical antecedents. And another thing I learned in your book that I did not know was that in the 1970s, in 1974, the Shah's police, SAVAK, also took your grandfather away for a few months against his will. And then he was returned to society. But these all demonstrate, I think, that there was a pattern and that it took years. It wasn't so simple as the overthrow of the Shah in 1979. Did your research give you any kind of insight into whether your grandfather was aware of these layers as they were happening ahead of time, or did your research show that it was a surprise? What did you find?
So it's complex. So the first time that Khomeini spoke out against him in the early 60s. I actually have it here. I don't want to misquote him. He was speaking out against Iran's modernization and Americanization, and so he had these students at his home, and he gave this speech, and I'm going to read it so that I don't put words into anybody's mouth. He said that the way to combat these changes is the country's. He says that the objective is Islam. It is the country's independence. It is the proscription of Israel's agents. It is the unification of Muslim countries. The entire country's economy, he said, now lies in Israel's hands. That is to say, it has been seized by Israeli agents. Hence, most of the major factories and enterprises are run by them. And so there's actually a footnote to that speech that that names these factory owners, and one of them says the Elghanayan family. So this is in 1964 when, who knows if the news made it to my grandfather's ears, right? We don't know. And I have no way of knowing that, but there was this anti-Semitism. And so there's that part. And then, like you said, the Savak came and took him in the middle of the night. This is in 1974, when inflation is rampant in Iran, and so the Shah, has devised this campaign to target businessmen, and so. The first target was my grandfather, and the next day it was in the newspapers that he was arrested for price gouging, and of course it was totally nonsensical. It was a campaign that was made up to lay blame on important businessmen, but then it didn't touch only him. It touched many Muslims in the bazaar, and it was something that really alienated a lot of people, a lot of business people, and they were worried, and they were wondering, like, is this a place where we should be doing business? This is not good for the country that businessmen are being blamed, instead of how do we fix the inflation that we created, that they created, the government created, because they were modernizing too fast. They didn't have the infrastructure to handle all this change. So prices were going up, and anyway, so these two things were really, it wasn't just that it was Khomeini who was targeting my grandfather, in his speech and in his words, but this happened also under the Shah. And then there was a third thing where back in the 70s, it was totally legal for Iranians to travel to Israel. And my grandfather was the secular leader of the Jewish community. Yet all his travels were being recorded by the Savak in his files. And how do we know this? They ended up in the wrong hands, in the revolutionaries' hands, and they used what was perfectly legal to do it, to fabricate these charges that he was a Zionist spy. Now, your question was, did my grandfather know about any of this? I don't think he could have known about his Savak dossier. Who knows if he knew what Khomeini had said. And when he was released from prison, he had a conversation actually with the Prime Minister Hoveyda, who told him, everything's going to be fine now. And at that time, Aryeh Levin, who was the Israeli a diplomat in Iran, asked my grandfather, "Don't you think like this is the time to leave? Like this, they did this to you. They pointed the finger at you." And my grandfather said, according to Area 11, "No, everything's going to be fine." I mean, my grandfather really loved Iran. He grew up there. He did his military service there. He was educated there. He had built so much. He was a member of the Chamber of Commerce. He had really built something for himself, with his family, his brothers, and I don't think he could imagine or fathom what could happen.
Yeah. You've referenced it a few times and you document it in the book, that when he would travel, say to the United States or to Israel, often family members and others would implore him not to return to Iran. Based on your research, why do you think he didn't take them up on it?
So, like every human being, like your decision is based on so many reasons, right? And so for him, it was this love of his country. And the period that you're referencing is, at the beginning of the revolution, when things were, they didn't know what was going to happen. Was the Shah overthrown? What was going to happen? Who was going to take over? There were all these different groups who were vying for power. And my grandmother had died. His lucky charm had died in May of 1978. So that was like pretty fresh. And he was, he had his whole life in Iran. And I think he just really loved Iran. And when people would say to him, it's dangerous for the Jews, you need to get out. I think what I ultimately realized is that he was just not the kind of guy to say, well, if it's dangerous, I'm gonna leave, and well, what's gonna happen to everybody? He was not the type of guy who could just watch things develop from the outside. And I understand that. As a photojournalist, and I work with a lot of photographers, they're always running towards where danger is. And that's one type of courage. I also acknowledge that it takes courage to like pack up and leave your country. And as we're seeing, this is right now with Ukraine, this is a question that a lot of people are asking themselves. So it's a tough decision, and his to stay. And
well, I recall a few of the times that you record in the book, he said to the others who were asking him, I can't leave the people who are looking up to me. I can't leave my employees, whether they were Jewish or not. I can't leave my employees, and I can't leave the Jewish community that I lead. And he chose to stay. But then the terrible irony that it was his execution that actually then ended up awakening to so many other Jews that they had to leave and make an exodus, because if it could happen to their leader, to Habib Elghanayan, they knew they had to get out. And of course we planned this talk, and you wrote your book well before what's going on now in the Ukraine, but of course it is so resonant, and one really could understand the courage on all sides, like, as you said. Should we talk a little bit about what the charges were against him, which are in detail in your book? I don't want to assume that anyone viewing this understands the abject horror that you describe in the book, the trumped-up charges, the fact that he was surveyed as a Jew and as a businessman. If you're comfortable.
Sure. So these charges were completely nebulous and really nonsensical. Things like corruption on earth, or being the enemy of the friends of God, or being a Zionist spy. So these are charges that are presented to him for the first time in court after so Khomeini also put him in prison when they came to power, and so he's faced with these charges, and there's 9 of them. I'm just citing 4 right now, and they're so nebulous that it's impossible to defend yourself against them. And there's no real evidence, and there's no lawyer, and you're being charged with these crimes that don't mean anything. So it's horrifying to think that you have 20 minutes to defend yourself. The judge is also the prosecutor. Amnesty International, cited every human rights violation that was occurring, and so that was their type of justice, and it's really unfortunate for that country that's the way they doled out their version of justice.
Now that you've completed the book, after so many years with this story and with this research, what were things that either surprised you or that you took away from your research that you might not have set out with in mind?
Sure. So I would say that one of the most surprising and actually delightful discoveries that I made is that the French Jewish community really looked out for us. My grandfather's story coincides with the best years for Iran's Jews, in a very long history, which is 2,700 years. And he was born in a time when there were schools for Jews in Iran in their segregated ghettos, and these schools were thanks to a Frenchman, a Jewish politician named Adolphe Crémieux, who knew that Jews had benefited from these ideas of liberté, égalité, fraternité, and wanted to give the same to Jews in the Middle East, in Iran particularly. And he started an organization called the Alliance Israélite Universelle. And so my grandfather went to the school, and so that was the first time that I realized how there was this man who had contributed to our success. And he started an organization called the Alliance Israélite Universelle. So that was the first instance, and it helped me understand how I ended up in a French school, really understand. But then the second time that another Frenchman came to Iran was in a time where he realized that things could be dangerous for Jews, and that was in November of 1978, when they didn't know what was going to happen, where the revolution was. It going to happen? Was the Shah going to stay? Was he going to leave because the Shah was still there? His name was Armin Kaplan, and from the World Jewish Congress. So he came from Paris. He had a discreet fact-finding mission to show his support to the Jews, to find out what can we do, what can international Jewry do for you if you need help, or what plan can we devise to get you out. So that was the second time, and I learned this while researching the archives of the Central Zionist Organization. It was a fantastic discovery. He actually still had, like, they had preserved the piece of paper where he had written all the phone numbers. And my grandfather's name was on it with his phone number. It was beautiful how it was preserved, too. It was very touching. And then the third time was when, right after my grandfather's execution, the French Nazi hunter, Serge Klarsfeld, flew to Tehran to meet with new government officials and ask them, you know, what's going on? Like, what just happened here? And so, you know, beginning with my grandfather's, you know, when he was born and being able to go to the school, to all the way to, you know, his execution, the French Jews were looking out for us, and I just found that very beautiful.
That is beautiful, and I think it also speaks to the fact that even with a 2,700-year tradition in Iran of Jewish life in Iran, or Persia before that, Jews have been itinerant, and including various exoduses, right? And then looking out for one another, like you just described so beautifully, that the French Jews did for the Jews of Iran at the time. So, you know, obviously you've written this book from the multiple perspectives of a journalist and as a granddaughter. And at the end of the day, with all the dispassion of journalism, it is ultimately also a personal story for you. You're not the subject, obviously, but you are the narrator. How do you feel now that your work is complete? Did you achieve what you were trying to do? Is there more left to be said? And what's your view on returning to Iran?
So, to answer your first question, I think I achieved what I set out to do. I wanted to find, you know, everything I can find out about my grandfather's life, put it together in a book, and preserve the history, you know, that was destroyed when he was executed. And again, you know, I carried this image of my grandfather for years, of him being alone, blindfolded, facing bullets, and the fact that he was alone was so just horrendous. And so now, you know, with a story told, it's almost like he's, you know, his story is with everybody who reads it, like the book is in their house and it's all there, and that makes me feel good. So in that sense, that's a big achievement. I mean, writing the book also helped me, like, discover things about myself and who I am, because the book is a lot about belonging and identity. So my grandfather felt like he belonged in Iran. And so, you know, it makes you question, well, where do you belong? I started out thinking that I belonged to Iran and Iran belonged to me, and that this great, you know, this injustice was to me too. And so I had this longing. And as I was researching the book, I kind of, you know, lost my taste for Iran. Even for, like, I'd lost my taste for Persian food, for Persian music. I realized that this is not where I belong. I belong here, or I belong in a society that's democratic. I belong in a society where I can wear what I want to wear, work where I want to work, where, you know, the LGBTQ community has rights, or where minorities have rights. Like, that's where I belong. That's where I want to be. And even if it's imperfect, there's hope. There's hope for progress, and we can work towards a better society. And so I realized that I'm American, and this is where I belong. And And so I hope that one of the other goals that the book helped to achieve is that it leaves something for, if Iran ever decides to reckon with its history of past injustices. And this is one story out of many, right? I set out to write my grandfather's story, but there are many stories. That this could be a part of what allows them to, reckon with this injustice and move forward. And I don't want to go back there unless that happens.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And we're all the better for this conversation and for all of the years that you put in to documenting this story. Your grandfather was a Titan before his execution, and the execution just made him all the more important, but not only because he was executed, but because of what he had done in his life, his achievements that everyone knew and that everyone was proud of. But certainly in his execution, he became a historical figure whose story affected thousands of other people that he never met. And your documenting it helps preserve that history for all of us. So thank you. And I'm thanking you on behalf of SHAI, as well as the library. And for anyone out there who's wondering, this is being recorded and will be up on the websites of the Great Neck Public Library, as well as SHAI, SHAIUSA.org, at some time soon. And we thank you very much. And of course, the book is available for anyone who would like to read it. I urge you all to do so.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you.